a Lakota chief named Sitting Bull stood tall in 1876, his eyes fierce with a vision of U.S. soldiers dropping like grasshoppers into his camp. On June 25, by the Little Bighorn River, this came true. Lieutenant Colonel Custer, a famed Civil War hero, marched 600 men toward a village he thought he could crush. Instead, over 1,800 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, waited for him. In less than an hour, every soldier under Custer fell. This was no simple fight. It was a bold cry from native peoples defending their world. How could 1,800 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, under the leadership of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeat 600 American soldiers commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Custer in less than an hour on the banks of the Little Bighorn River? On June 25, 1876. To unravel this astonishing victory, we must first step back and explore the swirling currents of history, strategy, and resolve that converged on the Little Bighorn River that day. In this introduction, we'll unveil the Battle of the Little Bighorn by delving into the historical context, the key figures, and the pivotal events that shaped this momentous clash. Introduction: Unveiling the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Hello, fellow history seekers. Today, we're stepping into the dust and drama of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a moment where ambition clashed with resilience, and the American West was forever changed. Picture this. It's June 25, 1876, and the sun is blazing down on the wide open plains near the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a man known for his bold confidence, is riding at the head of his 7th Cavalry Regiment. His force numbers around 600 soldiers, and he's certain that he's about to claim another victory. But as his men move closer, the ground starts to tremble with the energy of something massive. Ahead lies an encampment of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, their teepees dotting the landscape like a city on the move. Estimates put their numbers between 1,500 and 2,000 fighting men, led by the legendary Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Custer doesn't know it yet, but he's riding straight into one of the most famous battles in American history. I'm not here to just recite dates and names. We're going to unravel the story behind this iconic battle, explore the forces that shaped it, and wrestle with its complex legacy. This isn't just a tale of soldiers and strategies. It's a story about people, their lives, and the clash of two very different worlds. We'll look at the broken treaties that sparked the conflict, the battlefield tactics that decided the outcome, and the courage that shone through on both sides. Most of all, we'll give a special nod to the native peoples, whose bravery and determination defined this day. Their victory was hard-fought and unforgettable, and it deserves to be told with respect. Let's set the scene a little more. The Battle of the Little Bighorn happened during a time of huge change in the United States. Back in the mid-1800s, the American West was a place of dreams and disputes. The U.S. government wanted more land for settlers, miners, and railroads. That land, though, belonged to Native American tribes, who had called it home for generations. The trouble really heated up in 1874 when gold was found in the Black Hills, a sacred area promised to the Sioux by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. That treaty said the land was theirs, but gold changed everything. Thousands of prospectors poured in, breaking the agreement. The government tried to buy the Black Hills, offering money and supplies, but the tribes, led by men like Sitting Bull, said no. They weren't going to give up their home. So, in December 1875, the government lost patience and issued an order. All Native Americans had to move to reservations by January 31, 1876, or be considered enemies. Many refused, and by June, the stage was set for a showdown. Now, let's talk about the battle itself. Custer's 7th Cavalry was part of a larger plan to force the tribes onto reservations. His regiment was split into groups that day, with Custer leading about 210 men directly into the fight. He thought he was facing a smaller force, maybe a few hundred warriors at most. Historical accounts, like those from native survivors, tell us he was wrong. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come together in a huge gathering, with numbers swelling because it was summer, a time for hunting and ceremonies. Some historians estimate that the encampment held 7,000 people total, including women and children, with those 1,500 to 2,000 warriors ready to defend it. Custer's scouts warned him about the size of the village, but he pressed on, splitting his forces and hoping to catch the enemy off guard. Instead, he walked into a trap. The fighting was fast and fierce. It started around 3 p.m. and was over in less than an hour. Custer and every single man under his command died on a hill, now called Last Stand Hill. The native warriors used rifles, bows, and arrows, outnumbering and outmaneuvering the soldiers. Reports from the time say the 7th Cavalry lost 268 men overall, counting other detachments that were attacked nearby. The native side lost far fewer, though exact numbers are hard to pin down. Some accounts suggest 30 warriors died, while others say it could have been as high as 300. Either way, it was a crushing defeat for the U.S. Army and a moment of triumph for the tribes. But this victory came at a cost. The Battle of the Little Bighorn shocked the nation. Newspapers spread the news fast, calling it a disaster. The government doubled down, sending more troops to the west. Within a year, most of the Lakota and Cheyenne were forced onto reservations, their way of life under attack. Sitting Bull fled to Canada for a time, and Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877, only to be killed later that year under suspicious circumstances. The battle was a win on the field, but it marked the beginning of the end for the freedom the tribes had known. So why does this matter? This battle wasn't just a fight between soldiers and warriors. It was a clash of cultures, a turning point in history. For the U.S., it was a wake-up call about the strength of the native resistance. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was a stand for survival. Those warriors didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with heart. They were protecting their families, their traditions, and their land against a force that had already taken so much. Their courage wasn't just in their numbers or their tactics. It was in their refusal to give up, even when the odds were stacked against them, long after the smoke cleared. In this video, we're going to dig deep into all of this. We'll walk through the events leading up to June 25, 1876, and break down what happened during those chaotic hours. We'll look at Custer's decisions, the native leaders' strategies, and the bigger picture of what was happening in the West. We'll use accounts from the time, like the stories told by warriors who were there, and the reports written by soldiers who survived other parts of the campaign. We're not here to pick sides or point fingers. We're here to understand, to explore, and to honor the people who lived through this incredible moment. So, let's get started. Grab a seat by the fireside, because we're about to journey back to a day when dust rose, drums echoed, and history was written in the blood and bravery of those who stood their ground at the Little Bighorn. This is a story of ambition, resilience, and a legacy that still speaks to us today. Let's dive in and uncover it together. Historical context. To understand the Battle of the Little Bighorn, we need to rewind the clock and look at what happened in the years before it. The story starts with the Lakota, a Native American tribe, also known as the Sioux, who lived on the Great Plains. They shared this land with their allies, the Cheyenne and Arapaho. These tribes were strong and proud people who moved with the seasons, following the huge buffalo herds that roamed across what is now North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. The buffalo gave them food to eat, hides for clothing and tents, and bones for tools. Their whole way of life depended on the land and the freedom to roam it. One area was especially important to the Lakota, the Black Hills. This mountain range, located in what is now western South Dakota, and northeastern Wyoming was not just a place with trees and rivers. It was sacred to them. They called it Pahasapa, and it was where they went to pray, hold ceremonies, and feel close to their spirits. For the Lakota, the Black Hills were not something you could own or sell. They were part of who they were. Back in the 1800s, the United States was growing fast. More and more Americans were moving west, looking for land, wealth, and new opportunities. This push west was called Manifest Destiny, the idea that Americans were meant to take over the whole continent. But as settlers, miners, and soldiers moved into the Great Plains, they ran into the Native American tribes, who had lived there for generations. This caused trouble, and soon fights broke out. In 1851, the U.S. government tried to make peace by signing the Treaty of Fort Laramie. This was an agreement with the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes. It set up boundaries for their lands and promised that white settlers would stay out. The government hoped this would stop the fighting, but it didn't work. Settlers kept crossing the lines, and the army didn't do much to stop them. The treaty was weak, and the peace didn't last. By the 1860s, things got worse. A big conflict called Red Cloud's War started in 1866. It was named after Red Cloud, a fierce Oglala Lakota chief. The U.S. Army wanted to build forts along the Bozeman Trail, a path that went right through Lakota hunting grounds. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fought back hard. They won many battles and made life tough for the soldiers. After 2 years of fighting, the government gave up. In 1868, they signed a new Treaty of Fort Laramie. This time, they promised the Lakota and their allies a huge area called the Great Sioux Reservation. It covered about 60 million acres, including all of western South Dakota and parts of North Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana. The Black Hills were part of this land, and the treaty said no white person could come in without permission from the tribes. The deal was clear. This land belonged to the Lakota forever. For a while, things were calm. The Lakota lived their lives, hunting buffalo and moving across the plains. But that peace didn't last long. In 1874, something big happened. A group of soldiers and explorers, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, went into the Black Hills. They were sent by the government to check out the area. What they found changed everything: gold. Custer's team reported that the hills were full of it. Newspapers spread the news fast, and people got excited. Gold meant money, and lots of Americans wanted to get rich. By 1875, the Black Hills were swarming with people. Over 15,000 prospectors, miners, and fortune seekers poured in. They set up camps, dug mines, and even built towns like Deadwood, which still exists today. Some estimates say that in just 1 year, more than 800 mining claims were filed. This was a huge problem, because the Treaty of Fort Laramie said the Black Hills were off-limits. The Lakota watched as their sacred land was invaded. At first, the U.S. Army tried to keep the miners out. Soldiers were sent to patrol the borders and turn people away. But there were too many prospectors, and the Army couldn't stop them all. The government soon gave up trying. Instead of protecting the treaty, the U.S. decided to take the land. In 1875, they sent officials to meet with the Lakota leaders. They offered to buy the Black Hills for $6 million. That's about $150 million in today's money. But to the Lakota, it wasn't about the price. Chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse said no. Sitting Bull, a leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, spoke for many when he refused to sell. He didn't trust the government, and he saw the Black Hills as more than just land. It was their home, their history, and their spirit. The Cheyenne and Arapaho felt the same way. To them, giving up the Black Hills would be like giving up who they were. The government didn't like this answer. They wanted the gold, and they wanted control. So, on December 6, 1875, they sent out an order. It said that all Native Americans who weren't living on the reservations had to come in by January 31, 1876. If they didn't, they would be called hostile, and the army would come after them. This was a tough demand. Winter on the plains was brutal, with snow and freezing cold. Moving hundreds of people, including women and children, over hundreds of miles in just a few weeks was nearly impossible. Sitting Bull and many others refused. They weren't going to let the government push them around again. When the deadline passed, the U.S. Army got ready to fight. In the spring of 1876, they planned a big campaign. They sent out 3 groups of soldiers, totaling about 2,500 men, to find the hostile tribes and force them onto the reservations. Meanwhile, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were coming together. By June, thousands of them had gathered along the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Some historians say there were between 6,000 and 10,000 people in this camp, including about 500 to 2,000 warriors. They were there to hunt, trade, and prepare for the summer. In early June 1876, something important happened. Sitting Bull took part in a Sundance ceremony near Rosebud Creek, about 40 miles from the Little Bighorn. The Sundance was a sacred event. Men danced for days with no food or water, sometimes piercing their skin with sticks to offer their pain to the spirits. It was a way to ask for strength and guidance. During this ceremony, Sitting Bull had a vision. He saw U.S. soldiers falling upside down into his camp, like grasshoppers dropping from the sky. To the Lakota, this was a sign. It meant they would win a great battle against the army. The vision spread through the camp, and it gave the warriors hope. They believed the spirits were with them, and they were ready to fight for their land. Why it was more than just a fight. This wasn't just a skirmish over land. It was the boiling point of decades of betrayal. For years, the U.S. government had made promises to the Native American tribes and then broken them. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 was ignored. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 was supposed to last forever, but it fell apart in less than 6 years. Each time, the government took more land and gave less respect. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had seen their hunting grounds shrink, their buffalo hunted by settlers, and their people pushed aside. By 1876, they had lost trust in anything the government said. The discovery of gold in 1874 was the final straw. The government didn't care about the treaty when there was money to be made. Those 15,000 prospectors didn't just break the law. They showed how little the U.S. valued Native rights. The ultimatum in 1875 proved it even more. It wasn't about peace anymore. It was about power and greed. The government wanted the Black Hills, and they were willing to start a war to get them. There was also a bigger problem. The two sides didn't understand each other. The U.S. wanted the Native Americans to live like white settlers. They thought everyone should stay in one place, build farms, and grow crops. But the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho weren't farmers. They were hunters and travelers. Their lives were built around the buffalo and the wide open plains. To them, reservations were like prisons. Asking them to give up their freedom was asking them to give up their culture. Sitting Bull's vision wasn't superstition. It was a rallying cry, rooted in a deep understanding of the stakes. The Lakota and their allies knew they were up against a strong enemy. The U.S. Army had guns, cannons, and thousands of soldiers. But the Native Americans had something else, a reason to fight. They were protecting their families, their land, and their way of life. When Sitting Bull saw those soldiers falling like grasshoppers, it wasn't just a dream. It was a promise to his people that they could stand up and win, even against the odds. The numbers tell the story too. The Great Sioux Reservation started with 60 million acres in 1868. By 1876, the government was already trying to take the Black Hills, about 7 million acres, away. Over 15,000 miners invaded in just 1 year. The army sent 2,500 soldiers to fight a camp of up to 10,000 Native Americans. This wasn't a small argument. It was a clash that had been building for a long time. So, as we head into the Battle of the Little Bighorn, remember this. It was more than a fight on a hot day in June 1876. It was the moment when years of broken promises, stolen land, and clashing worlds came together. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho weren't just defending the Black Hills. They were defending everything they believed in. And the U.S. government, hungry for gold and control, was ready to take it all away. The stage was set for a battle that would echo through history. The battle unfolds. Let's jump to June 1876. The United States Army is in the middle of a huge effort to force Native American tribes onto reservations. These tribes, like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, refuse to give up their land and way of life. The U.S. government calls them hostiles and wants them stopped. To make this happen, the Army comes up with a three-pronged campaign. This means they send 3 separate groups of soldiers to attack from different directions. One group is led by General Alfred Terry. Under him is Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a famous officer with a reputation from the Civil War. Custer's job is to lead part of Terry's force, the 7th Cavalry, and scout the Little Bighorn Valley in what is now Montana. His mission is to find the Native Americans and report back. On June 25, 1876, Custer and his men are riding through the hot, dusty valley. They've been moving for days, and the soldiers are tired. Their horses are worn out too. But Custer is excited. He's eager to find the enemy and win a big fight. Around noon, his scouts climb up to a high spot called the Crow's Nest. From there, they look down and see something incredible. Along the Little Bighorn River is a massive Native American village. This isn't a small group of tents. It's a giant encampment stretching for miles. Historians say there were about 7,000 people living there. That includes women, children, and elders. But the number that matters most to Custer is the warriors. There are between 1,500 and 2,000 fighting men from the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. These warriors are tough, skilled, and ready to protect their homes. Custer now has a big decision to make. General Terry gave him clear orders: find the village, then wait for the rest of the army to arrive. The plan is to attack together with more soldiers so they have a better chance of winning. But Custer doesn't like waiting. He's worried the Native Americans will spot his men and run away before he can fight them. He also thinks his 7th Cavalry can handle the job alone. His regiment has about 600 soldiers in total. That sounds like a lot, but it's not when you see what they're up against. Still, Custer is confident. He's won battles before, and he believes he can do it again. So, instead of waiting, he decides to attack right away. To do this, he splits his 600 men into 3 groups. The first group is led by Major Marcus Reno. Reno has about 140 soldiers. The second group is led by Captain Frederick Benteen, with around 125 men. Custer keeps the third group for himself, about 210 soldiers. There's also a smaller group left behind to guard the supply wagons, but they don't join the fight. Custer's plan is simple. He wants Reno to attack the southern end of the village first. This will distract the warriors. Then, Custer will take his men north and hit the village from the other side. Benteen is supposed to follow behind and bring extra ammunition and support when needed. It's a bold plan, but it's risky. Splitting up means each group has fewer men to fight with. Around 3 p.m., Major Reno starts the attack. His 140 soldiers cross the Little Bighorn River on horseback and charge toward the village. At first, they move fast, kicking up dust as they ride. But as they get closer, trouble hits. Hundreds of warriors come running and riding out to meet them. The soldiers expect maybe a few dozen fighters, but there are way more. Some estimates say 500 to 600 warriors face Reno's men right away. These warriors are fierce. Many are on horses, galloping in circles, and shooting arrows and bullets. Others hide in the tall grass or behind bushes, picking off soldiers one by one. Reno's men try to hold a line and fire their rifles, but it's no use. The warriors are too fast and too many. After about 20 minutes, Reno sees his group is in danger. His soldiers are getting shot down, and the warriors keep coming. He decides they can't stay. He yells for his men to retreat back across the river to a safer spot. They turn and run toward the trees along the water, but the retreat goes badly. The warriors chase them, shouting and shooting. Some soldiers fall off their horses. Others get hit as they try to cross the shallow river. By the time Reno's group reaches the other side and climbs a hill, they're a mess. About 40 of his 140 men are dead or missing. That's almost 1 out of every 3 soldiers gone in less than half an hour. The survivors dig in on the hill, later called Reno Hill, and try to hold on. They're scared, low on bullets, and waiting for help. While Reno is fighting, Custer is moving his 210 men along the ridges on the east side of the river. He's looking for a way to attack the northern part of the village. From up high, he can see the huge camp below, but then he notices something else. Warriors are coming toward him. Not just a few, but hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or more. The Native Americans have seen his soldiers and are ready to fight back. Custer probably realizes now that he's in trouble. He thought the village had fewer warriors. He thought they might run. Instead, they're charging at him with everything they've got. Custer tells his men to head to a hill. This spot will later be called Last Stand Hill. He hopes they can defend it. His 210 soldiers spread out and start shooting. But the warriors are everywhere. There are about 1,800 of them in total, and many join the attack on Custer. They surround the hill, using the land to their advantage. Some ride horses up the slopes, firing as they go. Others creep through the ravines and gullies, getting close enough to shoot arrows or bullets. The warriors have good weapons too. Many carry repeating rifles, like the Henry or Winchester, which can fire 15 or 16 shots without reloading. Custer's men have single-shot Springfield rifles. They can only fire once, then reload. That makes a huge difference in a fast fight. The battle is loud and wild. Gunshots echo across the valley. Horses scream. Men yell as they fall. According to some Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who were there, the fight doesn't last long. They say it's over in less than an hour, maybe even 30 minutes. Custer's 210 men are trapped. The warriors close in from all sides. The soldiers try to shoot back, but they're running out of bullets. Some try to escape down the hill, but the warriors catch them. Others stay and fight until the end. When it's over, every single one of Custer's soldiers is dead. That's 210 men gone. Custer is found on the hill with 2 gunshot wounds, one in his chest and one in his head. His famous yellow hair makes him easy to spot among the bodies. Back at Reno Hill, Captain Benteen arrives with his 125 men. He's supposed to help Custer, but he sees Reno's group under attack. Warriors are still shooting at them from below. Benteen decides to stay and help Reno instead of riding to find Custer. Together, they fight off the warriors for hours. The attacks keep coming until late that night and even into June 26. Finally, the Native Americans pull back. They've heard more U.S. soldiers are on the way, and they don't want to face a bigger army. When the fighting stops, the U.S. Army counts its losses. In total, 268 soldiers are dead. That includes all 210, with Custer, the 40, from Reno's retreat, and a few more from the hill. The Native Americans lose fewer people. Some say about 40 warriors die. Others think it's closer to 100. Either way, it's a clear win for the tribes. But here's something to think about. In stories, movies, and paintings, people often call this Custer's last stand. They picture him and his men fighting bravely until the last moment. surrounded by enemies. It's a heroic image. But is it true? Not really. People who study the battle, like archaeologists, have found clues that tell a different story. They've dug up bullet casings and bones on the battlefield. These show that Custer's men were not in neat lines, making a stand. They were spread out, running in different directions. Many were shot far from the hill, trying to get away. Native American warriors who fought there say the same thing. They describe the soldiers as confused and scared, not heroic. The evidence backs this up. The warriors had better guns. Their repeating rifles could fire faster than the soldiers' weapons. Custer's men were also tired. They'd been marching for days with little sleep or food. And Custer made a big mistake by splitting his 600 soldiers into smaller groups. Reno's 140, Benteen's 125, and Custer's 210 couldn't help each other when things went wrong. The Native Americans, though, fought as one big force. They had 1,500 to 2,000 warriors working together. They knew the hills and rivers better than the soldiers did. Plus, they were fighting for their families and their land. That gave them strength. Let's look at the timeline too. Reno's attack starts at 3 p.m. Custer's fight probably begins around 3:30 p.m. By 4 p.m., his group is gone. That's just 1 hour for everything to fall apart. It's shockingly fast. The collapse of Custer's group occurred in less than an hour, while other engagements, such as those involving Major Reno and Captain Benteen, lasted longer. Compare that to other battles, which could last days. This speed shows how badly Custer misjudged the situation. He thought he was chasing a weak enemy. Instead, he ran into a powerful force, led by smart leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. So, what does this all mean? The Battle of the Little Bighorn wasn't a glorious last stand. It was a disaster for Custer and a triumph for the Native Americans. His choices, like ignoring orders and dividing his men, led to 268 deaths. The warriors' skill, numbers, and determination won the day. But this victory wouldn't last forever. The U.S. Army would come back stronger. For now, though, June 25, 1876, stands as a day when the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho showed the world what they could do. Aftermath and legacy. The Battle of the Little Bighorn ended on June 26, 1876, with a stunning victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. They had defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry in a fierce fight along the Little Bighorn River in Montana. For the Native Americans, it was a moment of joy and pride. Warriors sang victory songs, and families felt safe for a little while longer. Over 260 U.S. soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, including Custer himself. The tribes had protected their homes and shown their strength. But this triumph did not last long. The victory shocked the United States and set off a chain of events that would change life for the tribes forever. Right after the battle, the Native American leaders knew the U.S. Army would not let this defeat go unpunished. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other chiefs understood that a bigger fight was coming. They could not stay together in one big camp anymore. It would make them too easy to find. So, they made a tough decision. The tribes split up into smaller groups. Some, led by Sitting Bull, headed north toward Canada, hoping to escape the soldiers. Others spread out across the Great Plains, moving quickly to avoid capture. They knew the U.S. government would send more troops, and they were right. When news of the battle reached the eastern United States, people were stunned. It was early July 1876, and the country was preparing to celebrate its 100th birthday on July 4. Americans had planned parades and parties, but instead, they got word of a disaster. Newspapers called it a massacre and wrote dramatic stories about Custer's last moments. The public was angry and embarrassed. How could a famous officer and his men lose to native warriors? Many demanded action. They wanted the government to punish the tribes and prove the U.S. Army was still strong. President Ulysses S. Grant faced pressure to respond, and he did not hold back. The U.S. government acted fast. They sent thousands of soldiers to the Great Plains. Before the battle, there were about 2,000 troops in the region. After the defeat, that number doubled to over 4,000 by the end of 1876. The army also changed how it fought. Instead of waiting for the tribes to attack, the soldiers went after them. They launched big campaigns to find the hostile bands. One of these was the Powder River Expedition, which started in November 1876. Troops marched through snow and bitter cold to attack Cheyenne villages. The fighting went on for months. The army wanted to force every Lakota and Cheyenne onto reservations, and they were willing to do whatever it took. By 1877, the tribes could not hold out any longer. The soldiers kept coming, and life got harder every day. The buffalo, which the tribes relied on for food, clothing, and shelter, were disappearing. White hunters killed millions of them in the 1870s. Some estimates say over 4 million buffalo were slaughtered between 1872 and 1874 alone. Without buffalo, the Native Americans struggled to feed their families. They were tired, hungry, and running out of places to go. One by one, the leaders gave up. Crazy Horse, a brave Oglala Lakota warrior, surrendered in May 1877 at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. A few months later, he was killed there under unclear circumstances. Sitting Bull took some of his people to Canada in 1876, but even he came back. In July 1881, he surrendered at Fort Buford in North Dakota. The free life on the plains was slipping away. For the tribes, the victory at Little Bighorn was bittersweet. They had won a great battle, but it led to even greater losses. The U.S. government used the fight as an excuse to take more from them. One of the biggest blows was the loss of the Black Hills. The Black Hills were a sacred place for the Lakota. They went there to pray and feel close to their ancestors. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie had promised the Black Hills to the Lakota forever. But everything changed when gold was found there in 1874. White miners poured in, and the government wanted the land. After the Battle of the Little Bighorn, they saw their chance. In 1877, Congress passed a law that took the Black Hills away from the tribes. The Lakota got no say in it. They lost 7.7 million acres of land, a place that meant everything to their culture and spirit. The government went further. They attacked Native American traditions, too. They wanted the tribes to stop being who they were and live like white Americans. One way they did this was by banning sacred ceremonies. The Sundance was a big part of Lakota and Cheyenne life. Men danced for days, praying and seeking visions to guide their people. But after 1876, the U.S. outlawed it. They said it was uncivilized and had to stop. This hurt the tribes deeply. The government also took Native children away from their families. They sent them to boarding schools hundreds of miles away. Their kids could not speak their own languages or follow their customs. Teachers cut their hair and made them wear uniforms. By 1900, over 20,000 Native children were in these schools across the country. It was a plan to erase their culture, and it left many families broken. Even with all this pain, the Battle of the Little Bighorn left a lasting mark. For the Native American tribes, it became a symbol of resistance. They had faced a modern army with rifles and cannons, and won. It took incredible courage and skill. On that day, in 1876, about 1,500 to 2,000 warriors defeated Custer's 650 men. They used the hills and river to their advantage and fought with everything they had. Today, Native Americans look back on the battle with pride. It shows the strength of their ancestors, who stood up for their homes and families. In the 1960s and 1970s, groups like the American Indian Movement pointed to Little Bighorn as proof that their people could fight for justice. It inspired them to demand rights and respect. The battle also shaped how Americans saw their own history. It became known as Custer's Last Stand, and people could not stop talking about it. In 1879, a man named William Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, started a show called The Wild West. His show had actors playing Custer and the warriors, reenacting the battle for crowds. By 1890, it had been seen by over 1 million people in the US and Europe. Books and paintings told the story too. One famous picture from 1886 showed Custer standing tall, fighting to the last man. It wasn't true Custer died early in the fight, but it made him a legend. Movies kept the story alive in the 1900s. All this created the Wild West idea, with cowboys and Indians in epic battles. But these stories often left out the truth. They ignored why the tribes fought and what they lost. The trouble from Little Bighorn did not end in the 1870s. It led to more sadness years later. In 1890, the U.S. Army clashed with the Lakota again at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The Lakota were doing the ghost dance, a new spiritual movement. They hoped it would bring back their old way of life. But the government saw it as a threat. On December 29, 1890, soldiers surrounded a Lakota camp. A gun went off, nobody knows who fired first, and the troops started shooting. They killed over 250 Lakota, including women and children. Some say the death toll was closer to 300. The soldiers used big guns, called Hotchkiss cannons, firing 50 rounds a minute. It was a massacre, and it broke the tribe's spirits. Many call it the end of the Indian Wars. The dreams of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho faded away that day. So, was the Battle of the Little Bighorn a triumph or a tragedy? It was both. For one day, the tribes outsmarted and outfought a modern army. They showed the world what they could do. About 700 U.S. soldiers attacked their camp, but the warriors turned them back. It was a victory of bravery and heart. But it also brought disaster. The U.S. government hit back hard. They sent 4,000 troops, took the Black Hills, and banned the Sundance. By 1890, the tribes had lost their land, their freedom, and hundreds of lives at Wounded Knee. History is not simple. It mixes glory and grief. The people who fought at Little Bighorn wanted to save their homes and their future. They gave everything, and their story still echoes. Today, the battle stands as a turning point. It was a clash between two ways of life, and neither came out the same. For the Native Americans, it was a final stand to hold on to their world. For the United States, it was a warning that the frontier was not theirs yet. Over 140 years later, we still talk about it. The battlefield in Montana gets 300,000 visitors a year. People come to see where it happened and think about what it means. The legacy is not easy to pin down. It is about broken treaties and stolen land. But it is also about strength and the will to survive. The Battle of the Little Bighorn asks us to remember the cost of promises not kept and the power of those who refuse to disappear. The Battle of the Little Bighorn stands as a monument to courage and a mirror to our past. Custer's defeat shocked the nation, while for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it marked a fleeting triumph against overwhelming odds. Yet, this victory could not stop the tragedies that followed the loss of the Black Hills, the erosion of their culture, and the sorrow of Wounded Knee. Their bravery endures, pushing us to see beyond myths and recognize their fight as a defense of a way of life. This history weaves together valor, loss, and resilience, leaving us with a profound question. How do we honor their resistance while confronting the painful history it couldn't change?